A janitor just saved you $10 million, Ava said quietly, and the room laughed before the words even had time to land. The kind of laughter that echoed off glass and steel like it belonged there. Practiced, effortless, dismissive. Richard Caldwell didn't even look up at first, his Montblanc pen hovering above the final signature line of a contract thick enough to change the direction of 3 companies at once. The skyline stretched behind him through 40-foot windows, rain tapping against the glass in a steady rhythm, Manhattan blurred in silver streaks. But inside the room, everything was sharp, controlled, expensive, and Ava Johnson did not belong in any of it. Not with her gray uniform. Not with the faint scent of lemon cleaner clinging to her sleeves. Not with the quiet way she stood just inside the threshold like she'd stepped into the wrong world and knew it. "You hear that?" one of the executives muttered, barely hiding a grin. "We've got financial advice from housekeeping now." More laughter, softer this time, like a ripple instead of a crash, but just as cutting. Ava didn't flinch. Her fingers tightened slightly around the mop handle, then loosened, her eyes fixed not on them, but on the paper, on one number buried halfway down the page. A number most people wouldn't look at twice, but she had, because numbers had always spoken to her in a way people never did. Richard finally leaned back in his chair, slow, deliberate, giving her the smallest fraction of attention, the kind you give a distraction before you remove it. "You're interrupting a closing," he said, voice calm, controlled, the room quieting just enough to hear him. "Unless you're here to clean something, I suggest you step out." A pause, the air tightening. Ava took one step forward instead, not toward him, but toward the table, toward the contract. The soft rubber soles of her shoes making almost no sound against the polished floor, and that alone shifted something. Subtle but real, because she wasn't backing away, she wasn't apologizing, she wasn't disappearing the way they expected her to. "That number," she said, her voice steady, low, but clear enough to cut through the space between them, her hand lifting slightly, not touching, just hovering above the page. It's inverted. Silence didn't come all at once. It fractured, a few quiet scoffs, a chair shifting, someone exhaling like they were bored of the interruption already. Richard's jaw tightened just enough to notice if you were watching closely. His pen still hovering, still waiting. 5 seconds, he said, not raising his voice, but letting the weight of it settle, a countdown disguised as patience, somewhere. Behind Ava, a security guard shifted his stance, ready to step in, ready to restore the balance of the room. The hierarchy that made sense, but Ava didn't move, her gaze never leaving that line on the contract. The rain outside growing heavier now, louder, like it was pressing against the glass. Waiting, the entire room suspended on the edge of something no one had agreed to acknowledge yet. And then, almost reluctantly, one of the junior analysts leaned forward, eyes narrowing, calculator app opening under the table, fingers moving fast, then slowing, then stopping, his brow tightening. "Hold on," he said, too quietly at first, then louder, "Hold on." And just like that, the laughter didn't return. The analyst's voice cut through the room again, sharper now, no longer uncertain. "This figure, if it is flipped, the liability shifts entirely." His screen reflected in his glasses, rows of numbers cascading as he recalculated. One executive leaned over his shoulder, then another, the quiet hum of confidence in the room beginning to fracture into something else, something thinner. Richard did not sit back this time. He leaned forward, slow and controlled, placing his pen down with deliberate precision as if the movement itself could hold the room together. "Run it again," he said, his tone even, but tighter now, less certain. The analyst nodded quickly, fingers moving faster, the soft tapping echoing louder than it should have. Ava remained where she stood, not at the table, not fully in the room, just at the edge of it, her presence still an interruption that had not yet been dismissed, her eyes steady on the page, not on the people, never on the people, because she had learned a long time ago that numbers did not look back with judgment. Numbers simply told the truth if you listened long enough. Another voice joined in. One of the senior partners, older, sharper. "Check the appendix," he said, already flipping pages, paper sliding against paper in quick, restless motions. The contract that had felt so final minutes ago now suddenly fragile, like something unfinished, incomplete. The rain against the windows grew heavier, streaks running faster down the glass, blurring the skyline into motion. Inside, no one laughed now. No one spoke casually. Every sound carried weight, every glance sharper. Richard's jaw shifted slightly as he watched the numbers come together on the analyst's screen. The confirmation forming in real time. Undeniable. It is wrong, the analyst said finally, not loudly, but clearly enough that it did not need volume. If we sign this as is, we absorb the loss, not them. A pause followed, longer than any before it, the kind of silence that did not just fill a room but pressed into it, reshaping it. One executive leaned back slowly, exhaling under his breath. Another closed the folder in front of him halfway, no longer eager to move forward. Richard's hand rested on the table now, fingers spread slightly, as if grounding himself in something solid. His gaze shifted, not to the analyst, not to the contract, but finally, fully, to Ava, and for the first time, he actually saw her, not as a uniform, not as a role, but as the source of the disruption that had just altered everything. Explain, he said, the word measured, controlled, but stripped of the earlier dismissal. Ava did not step closer, did not reach for the contract. She simply spoke. The decimal shifts the exposure from their side to yours. Her voice calm, almost quiet against the storm outside. It looks small, but it compounds across the agreement. No hesitation, no apology, just clarity, the kind that did not ask for permission. Richard held her gaze for a moment longer than expected, then looked back at the page, the weight of what had nearly happened settling into the room like a slow, undeniable truth, and no one, not a single person, moved to escort her out the room. Did not return to normal. It shifted, quietly but completely, like something invisible had been pulled out from under it. Richard closed the contract halfway. Not fully, not yet, as if leaving it open might still offer control, but his eyes were no longer on the signature line. They were scanning, line by line now, slower than before, more careful. The confidence that once filled every movement now replaced with precision. Where did you learn that? He asked without looking up, his voice lower. No edge of mockery this time. Just something measured, something searching. Ava adjusted her grip on the mop handle. The plastic creaked softly under her fingers, a small sound in a room that had become too quiet. I studied finance, she said simply. No embellishment, no attempt to impress, just the truth placed between them like another line on the page. A few heads turned again, not in amusement now, but in recalibration, the way people look when they realize they have missed something obvious, something important. One of the executives leaned back, folding his arms slowly. Studied, he repeated, as if the word itself needed to be examined. Ava nodded once. 3 years, she added, her gaze still steady. I left before I finished. No explanation followed, but the absence of one seemed louder than anything she could have said. Richard finally looked up at her fully again, his expression harder to read now. Not cold, not warm, just reconsidering. And now you are here, he said, the statement hanging between observation and question. Ava did not react to the tone. She had heard versions of it before, softer, sharper, quieter, louder, always the same meaning beneath it. She simply answered, this is what pays the bills. The honesty settled into the room without resistance. No one laughed. No one challenged it. The truth did not invite either. One of the analysts cleared his throat, breaking the stillness. There is more, he said, his eyes still on the screen, fingers hovering above the keyboard like he was not sure if he should continue. Richard's gaze shifted instantly. What do you mean more? He asked, sharper now, the control returning. But in a different form. The analyst hesitated for half a second, then turned the screen slightly, enough for those closest to see. If the number is inverted here, he said slowly, then it affects the penalty clause as well. A ripple moved through the room again, smaller this time, but heavier, more focused. Another executive leaned in, scanning the section, lips pressing together. That is not just a mistake, he murmured, almost to himself. Ava's eyes moved back to the page, tracing the structure of the agreement, the logic beneath it, the pattern that had stood out the moment she saw it. It is consistent, she said quietly, not interrupting, but not waiting either. The same shift appears in 3 sections, her voice steady. grounded. That is not accidental. The words landed differently than before, not as a correction, but as a conclusion. The kind that changed the direction of everything that followed. Richard's fingers tapped once against the table, then stilled, his gaze moving between the document and Ava, connecting something that had not been visible minutes ago. The room felt smaller now, tighter, every detail sharper. The rain outside continuing its steady rhythm, indifferent to what was unfolding inside. "You are saying this was intentional," he said, each word placed carefully. Ava met his eyes without hesitation. "Yes," she replied. No emphasis, no drama, just certainty. And for a moment, no one spoke, because the implication was no longer about a number, or a contract, or even $10 million. It was about trust, and the quiet realization that it had almost been signed away without question. The word intentional did not echo, but it settled, heavy and immovable, like a weight placed at the center of the table. No one rushed to respond. Not this time. Richard leaned back slowly, his chair making a soft, controlled sound against the polished floor. His eyes no longer scanning but calculating. Not the numbers, not yet, but the people behind them. "Who drafted this section?" he asked, his voice sharper now, directed not at Ava, but at the team seated along the table. A senior associate shifted in his seat, flipping through the pages with less confidence than before. "It came from the partner firm," he replied, his tone cautious, as if each word needed approval before being spoken. Richard's gaze did not leave him, and no one flagged it. Not a question, a statement. The associate hesitated, then shook his head once, subtle, almost reluctant. The silence that followed was different now, no longer disbelief, but accountability. Ava remained still, her presence no longer an interruption, but not yet accepted, suspended somewhere. Between those two states, the rain against the windows softened slightly, the rhythm changing, slower, more spaced, as if the storm itself was easing while the tension inside held firm. One of the executives leaned forward, elbows on the table, fingers steepled. "If this is deliberate," he said carefully, "then we were not just about to lose money. We were about to sign into a position we cannot defend." The implication stretched across the room, connecting each person to the consequence. Richard nodded once, slow, deliberate, then reached forward and closed the contract completely. The sound of paper meeting paper was quiet, but final, a decision made without needing to be announced. "This deal is on hold," he said, his tone leaving no space for disagreement. No one objected. No one even shifted in resistance. The authority in his voice remained intact, but it had changed shape. Less about control, more about correction. His hand rested on the closed folder for a moment, then lifted, his attention returning to Ava again, this time without hesitation. "Show me," he said, not commanding, not dismissive, but direct. Ava stepped forward, closing the distance to the table for the first time, her movement steady, unhurried, as if she had already crossed a more difficult line moments ago. The edge of the table was cool beneath her fingertips as she leaned slightly forward, opening the contract again to the section she had noticed first. "Here," she said, her finger resting just above the line, not touching, just indicating. "The structure shifts the obligation." Her voice remained calm, clear. "Then here." She turned the page, smooth, precise, and here. Another page, each movement deliberate, building a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The executives followed her hand now, not out of courtesy, but necessity, their eyes tracing the logic she laid out. Piece by piece, the room no longer led by rank, but by clarity. Richard watched closely, not interrupting, not questioning, absorbing, his earlier certainty replaced by something more grounded, something earned. When Ava finished, she stepped back slightly, giving the space back to the table. Not claiming it, not holding it, just releasing it. The silence returned again, but it was not the same silence as before. It was quieter, deeper, the kind that follows understanding. Richard exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, then nodded once, more to himself than anyone else. And for the first time since the meeting began, no one in the room looked at Ava as if she did not belong there. No one reached for their coffee anymore. The cup sat untouched, slowly cooling beside polished leather, folders and glowing screens. The room had shifted into something tighter, more fragile, like every word now carried consequence. Richard stood up, not abruptly, but with a controlled motion that drew every eye back to him, his hand resting briefly on the back of his chair as he looked across the table, then past it, to Ava. "Who else has seen this contract?" he asked, his voice steady, but no longer distant. One of the partners straightened, clearing his throat. "Just our internal team, and theirs," he said, glancing down as if reviewing the timeline in his head. "It came in late last night." Richard nodded slowly, absorbing that, the pieces aligning in a way that felt less accidental with each passing second. "And we were ready to sign it this morning," he added, quieter now, not as a question, but as a realization, the weight of that almost decision settling deeper. Ava shifted her stance slightly. The subtle movement of someone who knew her role in the room was not permanent, her fingers loosening from the edge of the table, preparing to step back into the space she came from, unseen, unremarked. But before she could move, Richard spoke again. "Wait." The word was not loud, but it stopped her, and it stopped everyone else too. He turned fully toward her now. No hesitation, no dismissal. "How long would it have taken for this to surface if we signed?" he asked, his eyes fixed on hers, not challenging, but searching. Ava considered for a brief moment, her gaze dropping to the contract again, tracing the structure in her mind. "Weeks," she said. "Maybe months, depending on how the reporting is structured." Her voice remained calm, but the implication was anything but one. Of the executives exhaled slowly, leaning back, running a hand over his face. "By then it would be too late," he muttered, not to anyone in particular, just stating what everyone already understood. Richard nodded once, then turned back to the table, his hand tapping lightly against the folder. Once, twice, then still, "Set up a full audit of every clause," he said, the command immediate, precise. "I want legal, finance, and compliance on this within the hour." Heads nodded around the room. Pens moved, screens lit up with new urgency. But the energy was different now, no longer confident, but corrective, focused on what had almost been missed. Richard's gaze shifted once more, returning to Ava, lingering there for a moment longer than before, as if measuring something that did not fit neatly into any report or spreadsheet. "You said you studied finance," he repeated, quieter now. Ava nodded slightly. "Yes," she answered. Nothing more, no attempt to expand or explain. Richard studied her for a second longer, then glanced down at the contract again, then back at her, the connection between those 2 points now undeniable. "You caught what none of us did," he said, not as praise, not as surprise, but as fact. The room fell still again, not because of the numbers this time, but because of what that statement meant. Ava did not respond immediately, her eyes lowering briefly, not out of discomfort, but out of habit, the instinct to step away from attention rather than into it. "I was just doing my job," she said finally, her voice soft but clear, the simplicity of it landing heavier than anything else she could have said, because everyone in the room knew that was not entirely true. Not anymore. Richard held her gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, not formal, not performative, just acknowledgement, and for the first time since she had entered the room, Ava did not feel like she was standing at the edge of something. She was inside it. Whether she intended to be or not, the urgency in the room began to dissolve into motion, quiet but constant. Chairs shifted, screens filled with new documents, voices lowered into focused exchanges, but around Ava, something else happened, a stillness that did not belong to the rest of the room. She stepped back slowly, releasing the edge of the table completely now, her hands returning to the familiar grip of the mop handle, the plastic cool against her palms, grounding, steady, the kind of certainty she understood, the kind that did not change depending on who was watching. The rain outside softened into a lighter rhythm, droplets sliding down the glass in long, slow trails, the city beyond still blurred, but calmer now, less urgent, as if the storm had decided it had said enough. Ava turned slightly, not leaving yet, but no longer positioned at the center of anything. Just another figure in the room again, or at least she tried to be. Her eyes lowered briefly to the floor, catching the faint reflection of the overhead lights in the polished surface, distorted but present. She moved the mop once, A single smooth motion across the tile. Quiet. Almost invisible, the sound barely audible beneath the low hum of conversation returning around her, but not the same conversation as before. This one carried caution, awareness, the weight of something nearly lost. Richard remained standing for a moment longer, watching the activity resume, but his attention did not fully return to the team. It drifted, pulled back to the one variable that had not fit into the room until it changed everything. He looked at Ava again, not with surprise now, not even with curiosity, but with something closer to recognition, the kind that settles slowly, without announcement. He took a step away from the table, then another, the distance between him and the contract no longer the most important space in the room. Ava, he said, her name landing differently than before, not as a label, but as an acknowledgement. She paused, the mop still in her hands, turning just enough to face him without fully stepping forward again. Yes, she answered, her voice calm, unchanged. Richard studied her for a second, as if measuring how to bridge a gap that had existed long before this moment. Why did you say something? He asked, not challenging, not doubting, just asking. The room did not go silent this time, but the sounds around them softened, distant, like they had stepped into a quieter layer of the same space. Ava's gaze shifted briefly to the contract, then back to him. Because it was wrong, she said, simple, direct, no added weight. Richard's brow tightened slightly, not in disagreement, but in processing. You could have walked out, he said. No one would have expected you to. He did not finish the sentence, but the meaning remained. Ava held his gaze, steady, unshaken. I know, she replied, the words soft, but firm, a truth that did not need explanation. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The space between them filled with everything that had already been said and everything that had not. The rain continued its quiet pattern against the glass, the city breathing beyond it, and inside the room, something unspoken shifted again, not in power this time, but in understanding. Richard nodded slowly, a small movement, almost private, then stepped back, not turning away, but giving the space. Back to her, and Ava, without another word, lowered her gaze once more and continued the slow, steady motion of the mop across the floor, as if nothing had changed. Even though everything had the room did not rush back to certainty. It moved carefully now, like every step had to be checked before it was taken. Screens flickered with revised numbers. Legal notes began to populate in the margins, and the contract that had once felt final now looked like something fragile, something exposed. Richard remained near the head of the table but did not sit. His attention pulled between the unfolding audit and the quiet figure at the edge of the room. A senior legal advisor spoke up, voice controlled but tense. There is a clause here that mirrors the inversion, he said, highlighting a section on his tablet. If this passes unnoticed, they gain leverage in arbitration. Another voice followed, sharper now. That is not just unfavorable, that is strategic. The realization moved through the room in layers, not explosive, but deep, each person absorbing the implications at their own pace. Ava continued her slow, deliberate motion across the floor, the mop gliding in even strokes, the faint scent of cleaner cutting through the heavier air of tension and paper and polished wood. She did not look up, did not insert herself again. Her part had been spoken, but her presence remained, steady, undeniable. Richard stepped back toward the table, leaning slightly as he reviewed the updated notes, his fingers tracing the edge of the folder, no longer tapping, just resting, grounding. Pull the full history of their previous contracts, he said, his tone calm but firm. I want to see if this pattern exists elsewhere. Heads nodded, commands were relayed, the room now moving with purpose rather than assumption. One of the partners shook his head slowly, almost in disbelief. We trusted the structure, he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. We did not question the details. Richard's gaze lifted at that, briefly, then returned to the document. We will now, he replied, simple, direct, not defensive, just corrective. The shift in leadership was subtle but clear, not louder, not harsher, just more precise, more aware. Across the room, the analyst who had first recalculated looked again at Ava. His expression no longer casual, no longer dismissive, but thoughtful, almost unsettled, as if reordering everything he thought he understood about who belonged in this space and who did not. The rain outside had nearly stopped now, only occasional drops trailing down the glass. The city beyond sharpening back into focus, buildings regaining their edges, lights clearer, the storm passing without announcement. Inside, the air felt different too, less heavy, but more honest. Richard closed the tablet in front of him and straightened, his decision already forming before he spoke. "We are not just revising this deal," he said, his voice carrying across the room without force. "We are investigating it." A pause followed, not resistance, but acknowledgement. The direction set. And until we understand every line, nothing moves forward. The certainty in his words did not come from authority alone this time. It came from what had almost been missed, from what had been caught. The room accepted it without question, because the alternative had already been too close. Ava reached the far edge of the room now, the last stretch of polished floor reflecting the softened light from the windows. She paused for a brief moment, lifting the mop slightly before setting it down again, her movements unchanged, consistent, as if the room had not shifted around her at all. But as she turned slightly to continue, her eyes lifted just once, briefly, meeting Richard's across the space, not seeking anything, not offering anything beyond what had already been given. And in that quiet exchange, the truth settled fully. The power in the room had not just shifted because of a mistake. It had shifted because someone they had overlooked had seen what they could not. And that was something no one there could ignore anymore. No one spoke about signing anymore. The word itself seemed distant now, replaced by quieter movements, careful reviews, and the steady rhythm of correction. But something else lingered beneath it all, something unfinished. Richard stood at the far end of the table, no longer directing every motion, just watching, absorbing the shift that had taken place in a room he once controlled without question. His gaze moved again, not to the documents, not to the screens, but to Ava, who was nearing the doorway now, her mop gliding across the final stretch of polished floor, her steps measured, unchanged, as if none of this had altered her path. And in a way, it had not. She had come to do a job, and she was finishing it. Nothing more, nothing less. Richard took a step forward, then another, closing the distance that had once felt fixed. "Ava," he said again, this time without hesitation. She paused, turning slightly, her posture calm, steady, not expectant, just present. The room did not stop this time, but it softened, conversations lowering, attention shifting just enough to notice. Richard stopped a few feet from her, close enough now that the space between them felt intentional, not imposed. "I misjudged you," he said, the words simple, direct, without embellishment, no attempt to soften them, no attempt to hide behind formality, just the truth placed plainly in the air. Ava held his gaze, her expression unchanged, not defensive, not accepting. Praise, just listening. The kind of listening that did not interrupt, that did not rush to respond. Richard continued, his voice quieter now, but steady. "We all did," he added, a brief glance toward the table, where heads had lowered slightly, not in shame, but in recognition. Ava's fingers adjusted slightly on the mop handle, a small movement, grounding, familiar. She did not step closer, did not step back. She remained exactly where she was. "You almost signed it," she said, not accusing, not emotional, just stating what had already been understood. Richard nodded once, slow, deliberate. "Yes," he replied. No hesitation, the admission clear, unguarded. The room seemed to settle around that moment, the weight of it no longer something to avoid, but something to acknowledge. Ava looked at him for a second longer, then her gaze softened, not in forgiveness, not in dismissal, but in something quieter, something more grounded. "Then do not next time," she said, her voice calm, even. The simplicity of it carrying more weight than any extended explanation could have. Richard exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, then gave a small nod, the kind that did not perform, that did not seek approval, just acceptance of what had been said. He glanced down briefly at the mop in her hands, then back at her, the contrast between her role and her impact no longer something he could ignore. "You should not be doing this," he said, not as a command, not as a judgment, but as a realization. Spoken aloud, Ava followed his gaze for a moment, then lifted her eyes again, steady as before. "It is honest work," she replied. "No defensiveness, no apology, just truth." Richard held that for a moment, then nodded again, slower this time, as if understanding something beyond the words themselves. The rain had fully stopped now, the glass clear, the city outside sharp and defined, and inside, the room felt the same, clearer, more focused, not because of authority, not because of control, but because someone had chosen to speak when it mattered. Ava shifted slightly, preparing to move again, to leave the space as quietly as she had entered it. But before she could take that step, Richard spoke. Once more, not louder, not urgent, just certain. "We are not done talking," he said, and for the first time, it did not sound like a command. It sounded like a door opening. The room no longer needed direction. It moved with a quiet understanding now, screens dimming one by one as tasks were handed off, the contract closed and set aside, not discarded but no longer urgent. The storm outside had passed completely, sunlight breaking through the glass in long, clean lines that stretched across the polished floor, catching the faint trail left by the mop. Ava stood near the doorway, the handle resting lightly in her hands, her work nearly finished, the reflection of the city sharp beneath her feet. No distortion, no blur, just clarity. She glanced once more across the room, not searching for anything, just acknowledging what had shifted. Richard remained where he stood, but something about his posture had changed, less rigid, less guarded, as if the weight he carried had been rearranged, rather than removed. He walked toward the table slowly, then paused, his hand brushing against the back of a chair before pulling it out, the soft sound cutting gently through the quiet. He turned slightly, looking back at Ava, not calling her, not commanding, just leaving the space open, the chair positioned at the table, equal to the others, not at the edge, not apart. Ava noticed, her eyes resting on it for a brief moment. The gesture simple, almost small, but clear. She did not move toward it. Not yet. Instead, she stepped forward just enough to place the mop against the wall beside the door, the handle leaning securely. No rush, no hesitation. Then she turned back, her hands now empty, free of the one thing that had defined her place in the room. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was complete, the kind that did not ask for words. Richard gave a slight nod, not insisting, just acknowledging the choice in front of her. Ava took a step forward, then another, slow, steady, the distance between her and the table closing not with urgency, but with intention. The executives remained seated, watching without speaking, their expressions no longer guarded, no longer dismissive, just present, as if witnessing something they understood but could not fully explain. Ava reached the table and paused for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the back of the chair, the same chair that had been placed there for her. She did not sit immediately. Instead, she looked at Richard, her gaze steady, searching not for permission, but for truth. He met her eyes without hesitation, the earlier arrogance gone, replaced by something quieter, something earned. "It is your